Elaine Evans. I'm an extension educator and researcher at the University of Minnesota, and I work in the bee lab and for the bee squad here at the University of Minnesota. And I focus on bees, as you might guess, and generally pollinator habitat, pollinator conservation. And I will pass over to Katie Lynn.
Thanks, Elaine. Hi, everybody. My name's Katie Lynn. I'm the education coordinator for the Monarch Joint Venture, which is based in St. Paul, although I am in Apple Valley from my house right now. And my focus is monarch butterflies. You can see this is my cat Book behind me. He'll be joining us today too. Go ahead, Jen.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Schultz. I work with Elaine and Katie Lynn on a project called Pollinators in the Science Classroom, which we'll be talking about later in the workshop or in the webinar. It is a workshop series for teachers. So I'll be talking about that.
And then Elaine, you've got the power to share your slides. So if you want to go ahead and do that, I guess that means you're starting. Oh, Elaine, sorry, we can't hear you.
There we go. I assume people can see the presenter mode there.
Yep.
So yeah, I am going to give you some background on pollinators and and we'll go over some ideas about what to do with pollinators in outdoor education. I just want to briefly mention that a lot of the pieces from the presentation that we're doing today are coming from the Pollinator Education Toolkit, which we'll also talk more about at the end of the presentation, but something that you can get access to. So we're talking about why pollinators are important. So pollination itself is just moving pollen between flowers. And so bees and a lot of other animals that are pollinators like butterflies, wasps, flies, they help those plants produce fruits, seeds, nuts. A lot of those can end up being food that we eat. And so it works out to about 1 out of every 3 bites of food that we eat that is due to animal pollination. But in addition to that, it's 80% of plants that are relying on animals for pollination. And so, you know, this goes out much broader than what we eat. But we do have an activity that we call the pollinator plate, where we go over kind of looking at for food that's on our table, what food that we might have on our plates in front of us, what would it look like if we didn't have pollinators? So let's see, I've lost track of where the chat window is. There it is. But just if you want to just put in the chat, if there were no pollinators left, what would we have left on this plate? Would we have the whole apple? Would we have some apples? Would there be no apples? What do we think for apples being dependent on pollinators? So feel free to type into the chat if you want to. A dried up flower, no apple, 0 apples. Yeah, so apples are one of those foods that are really dependent on pollinators to move their pollen to be able to produce fruit. Next up, we have coffee. So this is important fuel for a lot of us. If there were no pollinators, would we have this full cup of coffee? Would we have some coffee? Would we have an empty cup? Just water. If you use cream or sugar, you might have some of that. So coffee gets into one of these kind of complications with this, where coffee flowers can self-pollinate. So just the pollen moving around within the flower from when it gets just blown in the wind and things like that, pollen can get bumped around and it can still produce some fruit. that turns into the coffee beans, but that overall production would be reduced by about 25%. So we'd have less coffee, it'd be more expensive, lower quality coffee. How about this? We've got rice and beans. This is this staple food source for a lot of places in the world. Ideas about what would be left if we just, would we have anything there? Just rice? No rice? So things do get kind of complicated with our food. So rice is actually wind pollinated. So that is not dependent on pollinators. So we would still have rice. Beans, there are some beans that you know, they do produce flowers and bees can visit them, but a lot of the beans that we use for our food sources are actually self-pollinated. So so you know, there's some options there. How about something like strawberries? So strawberries, they're kind of these complicated flowers where each one of these little seeds here is the result of something being, oh, somebody would just go in and pollinate themselves because they're not willing to give up on strawberries. So they, you know, each of these little seeds needs pollination to happen for it to make that big full fruit. So what can happen if there's not enough pollination? Some of those, you know, can get pollinated themselves, but a lot of times you just have these small, oddly shaped strawberries. So anybody who grows strawberries in their yard, they may have seen, you know, the difference between these big full fruits and these, you know, kind of lopsided ones that don't get full pollination. So you know, each individual strawberry is having 200 or 300 seeds per fruit. So there's a lot of pollination that needs to happen there. They can do some on their own, but without pollinators, we end up with small misshapen fruit. So, so that's just a few of the ways that pollinators are affecting the food that's on our plate. But you know, as I mentioned before, thinking about 80% of plants that are out there just in the world overall being dependent on pollinators, this ends up tying into a lot of other things that are really important besides just the food on our plate. So these pollinators are helping these plants reproduce, and then these plants are themselves food for insects, which are then food for birds or for frogs. This whole, you know, the whole chain of food chain that's built up with plants at the base. So our ecosystem health really depends on pollinators keeping those plants healthy. And then that also ties into things like soil and water. So a lot of broad impacts. People a lot of times wonder, then people have heard, you know, pollinators are in trouble. What's going on with pollinators? And so pollinators are this really diverse group. So we've got, you know, we've talked about bees, wasps, flies, butterflies. There's so many different kinds of pollinators that for a lot of them, we actually don't really know how they're doing. We're just kind of figuring out where they live and you know, what they do. So some populations are in decline, some seem to be stable, but there are a few here that we have some more information about. So we have more information about bumblebees, honeybees, and monarch butterflies. Those are the groups of pollinators that we really have the best understanding of, you know, how are they doing. For bumblebees, they've been more studied because they're these big fuzzy, they're a little bit easier to identify, they're really charismatic. There's been a lot more research on them for a long time. And unfortunately, the news there is not good. So it's about 1 in 3 species of bumblebees that are in decline. So in Minnesota, we've got 24 different species of bumblebees, and there's about 7 of them that we're worried about. We have 1 species of bumblebee in Minnesota that does have official endangered status from the Fish and Wildlife Service. So this means that it has some federal protection. This bee was once really common, now facing extinction. It's our Minnesota state bee. So the rusty patch bumblebee is something to look for out there. If they do still occur in Minnesota, we're one of the few places where people are still finding them. Honeybees, despite people hearing about them a lot, hearing honeybees are in trouble, their populations are not in decline. So they do have some health problems. So beekeepers are working to keep those colony numbers stable. They're able to, even though they do lose honeybee colonies every year more than is typical due to different diseases and things like that, beekeepers are able to make more colonies. So we actually have pretty similar numbers of honeybee colonies that are out there. We're not worried about honeybees going extinct. People know how to keep them. They know how to make more of them. We have enough right now. Beekeepers are able to supply enough for our agricultural systems, but we do need to do research and figure out how to keep them healthy. And I will pass this to Katie Lynn to tell us about monarchs.
Yeah, so monarchs are in decline. I don't need to put a trend line on this chart on this slide here for you to visualize that. There's definitely a decline both in the eastern and the western population. And we'll talk about the western in a second, but the eastern population of monarchs is probably one of the best well-studied population of monarchs in the world. There are people studying monarchs in all parts of its life. But the way that monarchs are counted in Mexico when they migrate down there for the winter is by how much space that they take up. And we have data going back to the winter of 1993 to 1994. And you can see there's a lot of ups and downs, but that's normal for any population, especially insects, for there to be ups and downs of the, from year to year due to weather, drought, predation, stochastic events like winter storms, things like that. That's all normal. But if you were to take the average of each of the decades that are on this slide, and I don't have the average lines on here, but the average of the first 10 years is about, I think, 8 hectares. And then the middle 10 years is about 6 hectares. And then the second 10 years, or the third 10 years is about 6 or just under 6 hectares. So we are in decline. There's no doubt about that. And then if you want to go to the next one, Elaine, the western population of monarchs, the monarchs that overwinter in California, on the coast of California, are even more in decline. They've declined 99% since the 1980s. We only have data on them and from 1997 onward. That's when the official counts started. But based on anecdotal records and things like that, we know that there's an estimated, several million more monarchs than were even counted in that winter of 1997. And the unique thing to note about the Western population is that we can estimate that population by the number of individuals. So volunteers that go out to count monarchs in California count them by individual monarchs clustered up in trees. But the other thing to note is that the number of sites that volunteers are counting at has been increasing over the last 10 years or so, whereas the population size hasn't grown or it's actually decreased. You can see there's 3 years, 2018, 2019, and 2020 had 3 very low years where they were counting, many hundreds of sites, but only thousands of monarchs. So monarchs are in decline for many of the same reasons our native bumblebee species are in decline. So the cause of these declines is complicated. In general, we could say habitat loss, which means that there's fewer flowers, there's more challenges with pesticides and parasites and diseases. Climate change is a huge issue for pollinators right now as it affects the habitat that they inhabit. But there's also concerns with pesticide use and how responsible we are with that. And individually, each of these issues would be concerning, but together they can interact in a lot of really complex ways that compound the damage that's being done to the population of the little things that run the world, the insects of this planet.
I think next we have more to talk about, but before we move on, we wanted to give a chance if anybody had any questions about this.
I see a question on 2020 monarch numbers. Elaine, you want to go back to the overwintering numbers for California? So next one, sorry, the green one. There is a number there. It's less than 2,000. It's 1,900 and some monarchs. So there were less than 2,000 monarch butterflies counted in California in the winter of 2020. Now, there were about 250,000 monarchs counted this past winter in California, which is amazing and mind-boggling to realize that they multiplied magnitudes higher than what they started with, and we're still learning more about why that huge jump happened. And there are a few thoughts, namely that one of the bigger ones out there right now is that there were monarchs that did not migrate last winter due to a mild winter, so they stuck around and bred year round, and then this year it was a cooler fall and winter, so they did migrate. But we may not know the actual answer or the complicated answer to that for many, many years yet. All we know is that the number increased. We don't know exactly why. It's exciting, but that also doesn't mean that our work is done. It doesn't mean that the population is recovered. It just means that it went up. And actually the population goal for monarchs is even several 100,000 more than what's been reported over the last even decade. I think it's about 500,000 monarchs is what they're aiming for. But yeah, we're not done yet. We have more work to do. If there were other questions, we have time.
Well, we can come back to things too.
Yeah, so one of the questions that I know Elaine and I get a lot, I'm sure Jen does too, and you all in your respective fields might get this question too. What can you do to help pollinators? So we'll cover 4 big actions that you can take to help pollinators and provide a little bit more detail on how to take those actions. Namely, the best thing that anybody can do to help all pollinators, whether it's native bumblebees or monarch butterflies, is to plant habitat. They need flowers. Monarchs and other pollinators drink nectar, but there are bees that also use the pollen to bring back to their young. So having a diverse array of flowers available for your pollinators will ensure that the habitat that you're providing is high quality. But you also want to make sure that you're keeping it free of pesticides, which also includes, fungicides and insecticides. Most of those pesticides don't discriminate against the things that they're trying to target for. So if you spray for like mosquitoes, you're going to kill all the bugs in your yard. So the other thing to keep in mind with nectar sources, with flowers, is to have something blooming throughout the entire growing season. So I know we're entering into the growing season in Minnesota. It doesn't feel like it. I know some of you still have, many inches of snow on the ground. And, we have had 4 sunny days of April so far. But as we head into these early stages of spring here, you can start thinking about, start looking around what's blooming this time of year, because even though monarch butterflies aren't back, there are native pollinators that still need nectar sources. You just might not see a whole lot of butterflies yet. But then as you head into, the depth of summer, having something blooming at all types of the growing season ensures that not just monarchs, not just native bees, but all the pollinators that you may not have at the surface of your mind also have food sources. And these can be, you could start small, you can go big. Whatever entry point you want to enter in on, just make sure that you're choosing a variety of different shapes of flowers, different colors of flowers, different heights, and definitely keep in mind that bloom time, particularly early spring and late summer and into fall, because those seem to be the times of year when, especially as our climates are shifting and this time of year, it's still very cold and not many flowers are out. That's when pollinators are seeking food out. And for the fall, it's especially important for monarchs to have a good source of nectar or good access to nectar during their fall migration, so that they have the fuel they need to make the whole journey and survive the winter to start their journey back in the spring. The other thing to think about with habitat is providing homes for not just not just bees, but caterpillars as well. So larval forage, planting host plants. For monarch butterflies, that's milkweed. For other types of butterflies, it might be things like golden Alexander or types of asters, things like that. It could be trees, it could be bushes. Just start thinking about what types of pollinators have or what types of pollinators you want to attract to your garden, and then research what host plants they require to actually complete their life cycle. You also want to think about nesting bees. Ground nesting bees require bare patches of ground. Stem nesting bees need they need those stems to pull out the pith to lay their eggs down inside that stem. And then with the bumblebees, leaving piles of dried grass and sticks in some undisturbed areas will be sufficient for them to create nests in there. And typically they like to be left alone. So I know that there are a lot of concerns, especially at schools, for bee stings and things like that. I get it, but for the most part, they leave you alone. Many of them are non-defensive. They don't have stingers. They're there for the flowers and whatever food you're providing. They're not there to attack you. Yeah, you can go to the next one, Elaine. So I mentioned some of these already, but just some things to consider when you're creating pollinator habitat. It's planting the flowers and providing homes for those bees especially. So the continuous bloom, something blooming throughout the entire growing season, pesticide free, host plants for larvae, and nesting sites for bees. If you're looking to install a pollinator habitat at your site, whether you're at a school or a museum or a nature center, and you need legwork or donations or things like that, you can ask for those either through volunteers or through donations from local businesses. A lot of local businesses are willing to help sponsor. They'll either help or they'll sponsor with money to some of these community projects, because it makes them look good, but it also benefits us as we try to beautify our public spaces. So don't be afraid to ask for things. The worst they'll do is say no, right? And then some examples of host plants, I mentioned some of these earlier. Obviously, monarchs use milkweed. It's their only host plant. There's lots of different species of milkweed. Minnesota has a 12 or 13 different native species here. And there's over 100 native species to North America. But there are other butterflies and moths out there than just monarchs. Monarchs are just the most well-known, best recognized, but there's things like black swallowtails that use golden alexander and other plants in that family, like carrots or parsley or dill. And then there's things like the ruby tiger moth that uses goldenrod as its host plant. And goldenrod, at least for my part here of Minnesota, is one of the best plants to plant for pollinators because so many different insects use it as their host plant, moths especially. The National Wildlife Federation Plant Finder lists 88 species that use golden alexander as a host plant. So it's got a big impact, even though you might not see them, that some of those moth species are very tiny. Those caterpillars are food for birds and other wildlife that fuel that whole food web that Elaine was mentioning earlier. Some tools. This is part of the Pollinator Ambassador Toolkit, but you can also find it online. This habitat assessment guide for pollinators in yards, gardens, and parks is a really helpful tool to help you score your habitat for what you have and how it's improved and what changes you can make, and then scoring it again for once those changes have been made. So you can check that out. And I think Jen might share the link. Yes, she's nodding. Otherwise, it will also be on the website. We'll make sure Anna gets all of these links to share them when she posts the recording. And I think Elaine is up next.
All right, so we've got a couple more actions to talk about here. So we talked about planting plants and providing homes. We also have taking climate action. So we know that pollinators, as well as everything else, are are suffering due to habitat loss, extreme weather events, all of those different impacts from climate change. And there are actions that we can all take to help reduce greenhouse gases. There's a lot of awareness that people have about the importance of trees as carbon sinks, but we're through a lot of Minnesota, we're in more of a prairie area, and there's actually a lot of our native prairie plants that have really deep root systems. So the native grasses and some of these other native flowering plants that can have root systems that are going 6 feet or more down into the ground, and those can also really make a big difference for sequestering those greenhouse gases. Also, things there's actions we can take, like supporting sustainable agriculture, using clean energy as much as possible, and also it's going to be really important to support strong environmental regulations so we can get to the point where we are stabilizing the climate. It's going to help pollinators. It's going to help our food sources for the future, our livelihoods for the future. So it's in the context of pollinators here, but clearly this is a much bigger issue. The fourth action that we talk about for pollinators that we're highlighting here is collecting data. So we have a few different projects that are highlighted here, and there are many more ways that you can help, but we really do have this opportunity to have people out there. You can take your students or whoever you're working with outside to participate in these projects. So we've got the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, which has been going on for a long time. This is doing an amazing job with tracking monarch populations. iNaturalist is an app that you can get on your phone, or you can interact with them on the website, and they're tracking pretty much any kind of living thing. And it's a great tool to do a pollinator safari. Go out with some cameras, take pictures of pollinators, share them there, and there's a community of people within iNaturalist that'll help you get IDs on the pollinators that you have there. There's also Bumblebee Watch, which is a similar idea to iNaturalist, but it's bumblebee focused. And there are opportunities to get involved in specific bumblebee surveys as well. So we also have the Minnesota Bumblebee Atlas, which is uses Bumblebee Watch to submit observations, but we also have volunteers adopting grids throughout Minnesota to survey for bumblebees. So, you know, there are opportunities. Did you want to talk about this, Katie Lynn?
You can keep going.
Okay.
The monarch stuff starts again.
Okay, yeah. So if you are, you know, do have gardens, schoolyard gardens, or at wherever you're working, if there's gardens that you can go out into, that it can be helpful to get more people out there collecting data kind of wherever pollinators are occurring, which is kind of all over the place. So these data could be really helpful in the bee lab here. We look at these data frequently to see where are these pollinators occurring. It really helps us understand where they are, and then we can really get more focused conservation actions where they are occurring. So these things also make a difference for policy and decision making for things like the rusty patch bumblebee, this endangered species. We make decisions about what's happening for them, for protection for them, based on sightings of where they are. So that could make a huge difference for what's happening. And then this also by getting people out, getting people engaged more with seeing what's out there. Pollinators are this great opportunity to observe wildlife that's just kind of all over the place. So they are out at these, you know, remote natural areas. They're also just in any garden in the city, anywhere. You're gonna, as long as there's flowers there, you're gonna find pollinators. So it's this chance to really make a connection to this wildlife that's all around us. So I mentioned iNaturalist. This is a really great community of people that are getting observations about all kinds of natural things. For bees in particular, there's some great bee experts. So if you're wondering what bees you have, there are there's a great community of people that go in and identify the bees and can help you figure out what you have, as long as you can get some good pictures, which we'll talk about in a second. So Bumblebee Watch, similar kind of thing. Sharing pictures just of bumblebees. If it can be, like I mentioned before, this is a group that's really charismatic. It could be nice to pick one group to focus on. And for bumblebees, or for any other of these bees or other pollinators, you know, wasps, flies, if you want to monitor anything else that's out there. Little quick photography tip. It is helpful to have a few different angles to be able to really see what's going on with them. So for insect identification, it helps to have a picture of kind of them from the top, so you can see their back, their whole back end. And it also helps to get a view from the front of their face, as well as a view from the side. A lot of times then we can get really good IDs there. One trick for being able to get all those different angles on a bee or a fly that's like and then flying away is if your phone has or camera has a really nice video setting, you can take a video of them and then get freeze frames of just those individual shots that you need of the side or the top, to be able to see what's going on there. So I'll let you hop back in here.
Yeah. So there are a lot of citizen science programs devoted to monarch butterflies. Monarch butterflies are probably, I think I mentioned it earlier, probably one of the most well-studied, scrutinized insects out there. There is someone somewhere monitoring something about the monarch butterfly at any point in its life cycle. And many of those studies are through community science programs. We mentioned one already, the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project is the longest running of the 4 that's on the screen here. And it started here in Minnesota at the University of Minnesota with Karen Oberhauser. One of the longest running sites is Falcon Heights Community Park, just north of the St. Paul campus there. Essentially with MLMP, well, I'll get to that in a second, but MLMP is the longest running of the 4 here. Or I should say the longest running count for larvae. Monarch Watch is about just as long. They took over the tagging program from Fred Urquhart in the early 1990s. So they track the migration through tagging, which works a lot like bird banding. There's a unique code that goes on the sticker that goes on the wing of the butterfly. And then there's Journey North, and Journey North might be one that you're familiar with other organisms. They do collect reports for things like bats and whales and robins and the tulip test gardens and things like that. But then what we use it for is monarchs and milkweed. So they track both directions of the migration as well as the presence of milkweed. And then an interesting one to do, especially if you're tagging or if you're working with older kids, is Project Monarch Health, which looks at a parasite that monarchs can get called, I'll just say OE for now. I'll give you the full name later. Next slide. So the easiest entry point into monarch citizen science is through Journey North. You can report monarchs at all times, whether it's your first monarch or not. But what we are most looking at this time of year is the first adult of the season. So each dot on that map there is one observation, and it's color coded to the time period. So the earlier it is, the lighter the color, the later it is, the darker the color. And you can see on that map there, that furthest north dot in the center there is Springfield, Illinois. That was just last week. So they're almost here. There's no milkweed for them, but they're almost here. And then each one of those dots has a little bit of, sometimes there's a comment. If there's a square in the dot, there's a picture. So that helps the program staff at Journey North verify that it is an actual monarch that's being reported. But you can get maps or report sightings for all stages of the monarch, milkweed, whether you're seeing a monarch out and about, whether it's your first monarch. In the fall, you can report roosts of monarchs or peak migration of monarchs to help us track the migration almost in real time. It's as real time as we can get right now without the small little tracking data devices small enough to put on a butterfly. Next slide. So I mentioned that MLMP, the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, is a long-running program, but this looks at weekly observations of monarch eggs and larvae on milkweed. So volunteers go out once a week, check the milkweed plants for eggs and larvae, report whether they're there, whether they're not there, how many they see, which stage of the monarch, which stage of the caterpillar they see, and then report it back to MLMP so that we can get graphs, data to see, we can look at survival, we can look at even just presence or absence of monarchs, and then the peak egg laying of collectively certain states can also help us predict what monarchs might be at as far as numbers go for the winter. And then there's also an activity that estimates survival of monarchs with parasitism. So you collect monarchs, raise them indoors in individual containers, and then report the outcome. It's not always a monarch. Sometimes it's something gross, but still valuable information. Next slide. So Project Monarch Health, I mentioned, looks at a parasite. It's a disease called Ophriocystis electrospira. It's a very long name. We just call it OE for short. It's a protozoan parasite that infects monarchs and other Danaids, butterflies of the same genus. It's microscopic. You can't see it unless you have a microscope, or as in the case of the egg in this photo, there's a lot of it. So volunteers will collect adult monarchs and take samples of the scales from their abdomen. On the stickers, you can see the picture on the left there is demonstrating that. Stick them on the card and then send it back into Project Monarch Health, and Project Monarch Health can then analyze those cards and determine the prevalence of the disease throughout a region, throughout the entire North American continent. And they can also look at it over time. And there was a really interesting paper just released earlier this year using data from this study that shows how this disease has changed over time, and that the prevalence of it is actually increasing over the last 5 years. And then the next program, another easy one, I mentioned that it's an easy one to do if you're testing for OE. I like to do them together because then if I'm testing for OE on wild monarchs and I'm also tagging them, I know that they've already been caught. So if I catch one that's already been tagged, I don't need to test it for OE. I can just release it again. But Monarch Watch, they coordinate tagging program. The tagging program, it is the only tagging program for Eastern monarchs. Any monarch that is east of the Rocky Mountains can be tagged through Monarch Watch. Those tags, you can start ordering them now. They won't ship them until August because we only tag during the fall migration. But those tags are unique codes to that monarch. If they're ever recovered, either along their migratory pathway or when they get to Mexico, they are reported back to Monarch Watch, and then we know how far the monarch made it, which is helpful data to see how, especially as climate shifts, to see if that changes. So it's another easy entry point into community science. So there are a lot of connections that can be made in multiple different subject areas within this conservation, within pollinators, not just within subject areas, but also on like a personal level. There's these connections that, and I know most of you are non-formal educators, so you get this, but there's this personal connection to nature that's being made as the kids in the classroom are observing all of these natural phenomena, whether they're participating in community science, whether they're actually watching things, whether they're counting how many bees are on a flower. Either way, they're still engaging with those organisms and creating memories, and hopefully contributing to an eco-conscious adult mindset as they grow. So I know that the Teach Outdoors website is a plethora of information for how to incorporate a lot of these things, resources to help, and then also sources for the benefits of outdoor learning. Like I'm not going to go into those because I'd be preaching to the choir. You all know where to find that information and how to talk to your administration about doing that. But just in case you do need a reminder, Teach Outdoors website there, and then the NAAE website has great resources, and Children in Nature Network, their research library is interconnected. It's one of my favorite resources for scientific papers to back up the claims that we all know about the importance of outdoor learning. All right, take it away, Elaine.
All right, so in the Bee Lab and working with Monarch, with Katie Lynn, with Monarch Joint Venture, and a few other partners, we've been working on pollinator ambassadors. So this idea of getting more people given the tools that they need to reach out to their communities, to talk to people about how important pollinators are and these action steps that they can take to help pollinators. So we've done this working with youth. There's some 4-H groups that are also doing work with pollinator ambassadors. So kind of all across Minnesota, there's some different county 4-H groups that are also doing some of this pollinator ambassador group work. If you're interested in connecting with them, and this idea also just ties more broadly into just trying to get resources to people to help them teach about pollinators. So I will pass over to Jen to talk more about that.
All right, remember to unmute. So the University of Minnesota Pollinator Education Toolkit is a really great way to share that all the knowledge that you're learning about pollinators with everyone, let people know how important pollinators are and how they can help them. So it was created with the University of Minnesota Bee Lab in cooperation with the Xerces Society and Monarch Joint Venture. And there's so many cool things in this toolkit. So they have interactive activities, games, posters. You can see on the screen, there's the pollinator plate activity and slideshow that Elaine showed at the beginning, just to kind of emphasize the importance of pollinators and the food that we eat. And then also there's some information about myths and realities, just highlighting things people might think about it, but actually showcasing what's real. You can go to the next slide, Elaine. And then also in that is highlighting some of these things that we've talked about, like how can you help pollinators? What are the action steps to help and to show your audience those steps, as well as using the pollinator diversity cards that are there to learn identification, to learn specific characteristics or fun facts about common Minnesota pollinators. So just kind of learning more about those. And then there's also some interactive games, including Monarch Mishaps, which is a game that helps you learn about the pressures that affect monarch populations. There's a game called Pollinator Garden Buffet, which helps you create a garden and strive to become a pollinator superhero. So kind of just fun ways to include people of all ages. There's also pollinator trivia. So you could host a pollinator trivia night or game time with students or with adults. It's great for everybody. And then as far as where you can get them, there's a lot of these are available digitally during the pandemic. We try to shift to make a lot of these things available for teachers and educators digitally. So you can access those through the Pollinator Ambassador website. You just fill out a form so we can kind of track the impact and so we know who's using them. But also kind of in progress is to figure out the best way to get it out to people, the physical copy. So interlibrary loan is one way, and then also through regional extension centers. So if you live in the greater Minnesota area, that if you have an extension office near you, you could get them checked out through your extension office. And you can go to the next slide. Yeah. And then if you're looking for resources, we've probably thrown too many resources at you, but if you're looking for more, we know that the pollinators are out, in, maybe April, May, maybe you get to see them in September. But if you're looking for activities to do with kids or whatever your audience is during the other season, you could go to Journey North, you can go to the Bee Lab, look at the curriculum we have there, the Pollinators and the Great Sunflower Project. So there's lots of things that you could be doing, not necessarily when you're observing the pollinators, but also just to learn about them and get that background knowledge. So you can look at that. And then finally, I'm really excited to tell you about our Pollinators in the Science Classroom. It is a teacher professional development workshop led by Elaine and Katie Lynn, among others. So we have our bee and butterfly experts, and it will focus on those pollinator toolkits that you saw a little bit. We'll be talking about implementation of that, as well as the Pollinator and Great Sunflower project, the citizen science curriculum created by University of Minnesota Extension. So the workshop is specifically geared towards grades 6 through 12 science classrooms. And the goals are to help teachers learn about pollinator biology, conservation, research, as well as build an understanding and the value of citizen or community science. And we'll be applying those scientific research techniques with students. So the idea is to have teachers learning protocols and collecting and analyzing data, and then developing their own pollinator focused independent research project, and then share out their findings, kind of experiencing what you're going to ask students to do. And it's all based on observations of the natural world and ecology. And so it's super fun workshop. It's 2 weeks long. We've had great reception thus far, and the workshop is full for 2022, but we're being proactive, and we're going to put a button on our website that can put you to a really short Google form. You just put your email address in, and then we will send you a reminder when the application process opens up for 2023. And the dates are already listed. We have them selected for 23. So if you're interested, we realize it's a time commitment. It is 2 weeks. So some people like to plan ahead. And so it's June 26th to the 29th and July 10th through the 13th. That is for 2023. So if you're thinking ahead, you do receive graduate credit and curriculum, and build a community of learners around pollinators. It's going to be a lot of fun. So I will pop in the chat now that I'm done talking, the link to all of that information, and I will pass it back to, I think Elaine is closing us out. Is that right?
Yeah, I just had a quick little thing just to go back to those actions. So thinking about this year in 2022, if you have plans to, if you just want to share in the chat, if you have plans to plant plants or collect data. I know somebody said they were signed up with the bee atlas, with monitoring a bee block, so they'll be helping to collect data. Or if you have plans to create homes, take climate action, and yeah, let us know what you're up to, and we're happy to take questions. And we do, so there's lots of, someone said there's never too many resources. So another couple places where there's lots of resources for information about, especially about bees, but other pollinators and pollinator habitat. We have lots going on at the Bee Lab website, which is blab.umn.edu. and monarchjointventure.org. I go to that site a lot. There's so much information there. And I will stop sharing this, and people can feel free to unmute and ask a question if you want, or pop a question in the chat, or observations if you have ideas, things that have worked for you with working with pollinators outdoors. We'd love to hear about your experiences.
I think I'm excited to do this at my house first, and then be able to bring it to different places that I'm at, just because then I could say, I do this at home. Let's do it here too. Plus it made my yard look nice. So
I have a question. My name is Leanne. I live in the Brainerd Lakes area, and my husband and I 2 summers ago took 5 or 6, I think, caterpillars, monarch caterpillars from St. Matthias Park. And we have a little, screen enclosure that they lived in. We supplied fresh milkweed and water, and we raised them to adults, 5 of the 6. One had some type of a disease, and maybe that was the OE. And we released them at Central Lakes College. They have a big pollinator field. So there are opinions by people that doing this changes their instinct to migrate to Mexico. Yeah. I didn't know if 6 was going to make a big difference. It was just something my husband and I wanted to track.
Yeah,
we took lots of photos and video.
I can elaborate on that a little bit. So there were a couple of studies actually out of the University of Chicago that did show that raising monarchs indoors, out away from the natural cues that they receive, like change in temperature, change in light, and aging milkweed, things like that, can affect their ability to orient themselves southward for the fall migration. That's only a concern during the migration. There was another study out of, I think, Ontario that showed that after a few days, monarchs could reorient themselves. But as you all know, in Minnesota, a few days could be all the difference in the world in the fall on whether or not the weather's nice enough for an insect to fly. So based on all of the new research from not only those, but also, past studies that have been done on, the effects of not having natural cues. The recommendations overall, and there are scientists that agree that it's not enough, and there are scientists that think that it's too much. So there's a spectrum here. But the general consensus is that if you're going to be raising monarch butterflies, you should also be reporting them to a citizen science program, like one of the 4 that I mentioned earlier: Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, Project Monarch Health, tagging for the migration with Monarch Watch. Just because then you're sharing that knowledge with the community at large so that we can learn more collectively than what you're learning individually. And if you're raising them, you should only be doing a few at a time. So 5 or 6 is fine. I personally don't raise monarchs of the migratory generation just because I'm also really busy that time of year, so I don't have time to take care of them. But I would just rather not worry about whether or not they'll migrate. So the other thing to think about when you're raising monarchs is to keep them in individual containers, because that helps you keep track of them for reporting data to particularly MLMP and for tagging, and then OE, I guess, as well. But it also prevents or slows the spread of disease between them. So keeping them in individual containers. I know it's not as fun as seeing them all together, but they are not adapted to crowded lifestyles. They don't do well in them. The disease spreads very quickly, and once one has it, the rest of them will get it too. And there's no antibiotics for caterpillars. The money that we spend on research for pollinators is better spent elsewhere than developing disease resistance for natural viruses and bacteria. So individual containers, a few at a time, report to a community science program, and you're good for now.
Thank
That
you.
with the Endangered Species Act listing in a couple of years, but for now, you're good.
Anybody else out there with any questions? It is right around 5 o'clock now. If you have any other questions, let us know. Otherwise, Elaine, Jennifer, Katie Lynn, thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm going to stop the recording here.